A very good morning to one and all present here. Welcome to online lecture series brought to you by Intersections, Banaras Hindu University. Intersections B.H.U is an informal academic platform under the aegis of Faculty of Arts, Banaras Hindu University. The purpose of this online lecture series is to address young minds of scholars, academicians, and mostly PG students and bring about an awareness of the recent and ongoing studies in the sphere of academics. Today, we have among us Mr. Danish Iqbal, who is currently working as an assistant professor in Aligarh Muslim University. He has also been a recipient of various fellowships. He was chosen as a 2018 fellow at the New York School for Social Research, Institute for Critical Social Inquiry, New York, in the month of June 2018. His trust areas include literary and cultural studies, minority discourse, fiction, and social theory. Today, he will be speaking on the topic, the subject of tolerance. So, without further delay, I, Agrima Mishra, on behalf of Intersections Banaras Hindu University, welcome you, sir. Before starting, here are some general instructions for the audience. Audience is requested to keep their microphones off throughout and not to share screen. During the lecture, one can drop the questions in the chat box, which shall be addressed in the question answer session post lecture. Now, the platform is all yours, sir. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Agrima. Could one of you please confirm if I'm audible to you?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Thank you. I'll very quickly begin by laying out what my talk is generally about, what is my approach, and I aim to have accomplished during the course of this conversation. Prior to that, let me very quickly make a few admissions. I'm sitting in my office right now, and it could happen that I may have someone coming in, so please pardon me for that momentary distraction of what happened. Secondly, I also presume that you may have at least cursorily moved to the place because much of my conversation will be based on, at least half of the conversation related to based on few writings that are I begin by thanking the forum in sections for today and all of you here for having me at your forum. And I also believe that this is an excellent initiative because this is in itself something that we should probably think a little harder about. That what is it about the existing academic structure that, in fact, necessitates that we, come up with these formations. However, so I congratulate whoever is behind this formation to the topic that I have chosen to focus on is called the subject of tolerance, and it covers a very wide area of, you can say, our collective existence. Okay? But more importantly, I'll begin by posing two questions, which I will leave unanswered as I go on to talk, and I'll hopefully conclude by coming back to those two questions. So the first question is intolerance the opposite of tolerance? is lack of tolerance called intolerance? Or can what we call intolerance be met by invoking tolerance? I hope that question is clear. And the second question is, what is it that we call tolerance? What is it that we name? What is that in? What is that uh, practice? What is it that we do when we are tolerating? So, my journey to this question has largely been through the question of secularism. But I'm not going to talk about secularism as a principal focus. I'm going to be focused on the question of tolerance. However, as all of you have first, you may have invoked this term, you may have been in the thick of what may be called toleration. With that familiarity, you know, we should all think about what is tolerance. It's whatever familiarity. It's not going to be overtly scholarly. I'm not going to throw any jargon. I'm going to keep it very conversational. And I just want for us to take a step back and think about it. How do we, in what different contexts, in what different situations, more importantly, in what different, with what different meanings do we use this term? So let me, to avoid confusion, let me separate the two elements here. One is tolerance, and the other is toleration, right? So one is an attribute that we call tolerance, and the other is a practice, right? Now, if one were to understand it like this, then we have a conceptual terrain called tolerance, and then we have our own lived experiences in many different ways, in all its complexities, where this concept becomes a source for us to, you can say, uh, invoke tolerance. Now, I am going to divide my talk into three parts. In the first part, I'm going to talk about two political theorists who I draw upon in order to elucidate the concept of tolerance. And I'll also justify why did I choose these two political theorists. Although, much as diffuse the term is, you have a wide variety of writings, very long time on the question of tolerance. So, two political theorists are a German political theorist called Rainer Forst, and then we have an American political theorist, Randy Brown, who I presume you may be familiar with. And in the third section of my talk, I'll be coming back to Nehru and Gandhi and talk about our own context in relation to the question of tolerance. When I say our own, I'm talking about our own, actually our own, like you and me and everybody else, how we live in our daily life, in our own society, in our own, within our families, extended families, friends, universities, campuses, etc. You know, or what we encounter even when we do not participate. What are the things that we encounter? So, as scholars or students of humanities, all of us inhabit a particular space, which also compel you to be a witness to so many. So let's come back to the first part here, which is the question of tolerance. Now, Rainer Forst is someone who is interested in the concept of tolerance, as against Brown, who is more invested in the practice. And or you can say, how tolerance operates, how does it operate? Does it operate merely as a neutral concept, or does it have very intimate relationship with the questions of power, history, culture, etc.? And if so, what are the consequences? Now, Rainer Forst very much like all political theorists, of course, trace it back to the question, to the period of Enlightenment, Renaissance, and then John Locke's famous letter on tolerance. But then, in doing so, uh, he teases out what we can call, what he in fact calls two different, uh, you can say, concepts, or you can say two different fashioning of tolerance. But in both that, even while he makes this distinction, which where one he calls the permission concept of tolerance, and the other is what he calls the respect conception of tolerance. Now, the permission concept for him is the traditional idea of tolerance as a concept. Let's be clear about that. Because he's talking about tolerance as a political concept. But the respect conception of tolerance is more recent as an evolution of modern times with the emergence of democracies all across the world and how we have come to inhabit these spaces and value tolerance as an ethical virtue. But prior to that, what he does is identifying three important components of tolerance, which is something which is also shared by Wendy Brown. And I'm doing this just so that we are aware of the conceptual scaffolding behind this facade that we call tolerance. When I say facade, I'm not actually meaning it as a pejorative, but the outward appearance. It also works as a pejorative for Brown, which you'll see later. So the three components that he identifies, the first of them is what he calls that tolerance necessarily implies an element of objection. Right? So it always comes into play only when you have, or when you object to something, or when you find something to be repugnant, to be something that you dislike, something that you wished were not true. Or, to put it more bluntly, something which makes you feel wounded, right? So that is where the objection concept, the objection component of tolerance figures. The next is what he calls acceptance. So once there's something which I wished were not true, for example, I'm traveling in a train and there's something that I actually do not like, is when you are kind of half asleep and somebody opens a bag of chips and you have all the crumbling, crunchy noise all around you, filling your sleep and you feel irritated. So what do you do? What do you do? I mean, you either just, turn to a different side and go to sleep, or probably plug in your ears, or maybe try to, be indifferent. Or if you muster enough courage, you just address the person politely and you say that you could keep it low. However, what he's saying here with the acceptance component is that when the reasons for you to find something to be objection is outweighed, is in some sense kind of is out, the reason for withstanding that objection is in some sense, you can say, it not only outweighs but ethically outshines the objection. Then what do? You accept even though you do not like. And then this disposition or this attribution kind of tilts the balance in favor of dominance. So I hope I'm right so far. I mean, sorry, I hope I'm learned you because I'm just quoting kind of here. The final component that he has identified, he calls it the rejection component of dominance, where you just do not believe that this is right, not only as per your own individual ethical commitments or beliefs, belief is an important word. Alright, even let me probably flag this in the beginning itself that when I use the word belief, I'm not only talking about religious belief. So I don't want my conversation to be limited to the idea of religion here, but it will figure when we go to Nehru and Gandhi later on. So if it goes against your beliefs and it completely fails to tilt the balance in favor of acceptance, then you rejection. So you work actively towards removing or annihilating or obliterating the very reason for its formation, existence, etc. So that is the three components. These are the three components that is identified. Now coming back to the permission concept and the respect concept. So very quickly, in the interest of time, as well as to keep it concise, that the permission concept can be understood like this. Think of a system which is headed by a monarch, right? So there is a group of people who you can call are different, who you can call are powerless, or you can call they are different in such a way that there is nothing similar to how a bigger group or the majority lives in that. And the monarch decides that instead of persecuting them, let's allow them to live, but within a framework, right? Now, when that framework is determined by or on the terms of that monarch, uh, that allows the minority group or that particular different group to live, but to put it simply on the mercy of those who have allowed them, right? Now, this is permission concept, which is the framework is essentially authoritarian. How? So you buy, it's a trade-off. So you buy the loyalty of that minority group, of that different group, of that deviant group, of that non-normal group, so to speak. So you buy their loyalty by ensuring their life and security, for example. Now, what it does is something that Rana Forrest calls included exclusion, right? As against permission concept. With the in the modern times, a horizontal, you can say, expansion of the mode of tolerance has developed, which he calls the respect concept of tolerance. So the respect concept is, let's say, two people or two groups or two states, whatever be the two formations, which are quite unlike each other, which they do not agree with on many things, particularly their ethical framework. So what do they do? Even though their disagreements remain on particular issues, on particular aspects of life, what they do is they show faith in the independent character of the institutions, which uphold a certain principle of existence for both these groups, right? Politically and socially. So, very much like, let's say, the concept of a neutral state, right? So, what do? They post their faith in that institution that this will be impartial. This institution will be impartial, and hence, even if I very deeply, in a very visceral manner, I differ with you on a particular matter, I will I will not go on to reject. I will not go on to, in a sense, kind of wish it away actively. Or to put it very simply, I will not act upon my beliefs in such a way that it impinges upon your own independent existence as a morally, as your moral right to exist. So this works both ways. This kind of transaction. Now, this for some reason, Rana Forest does not really uh, name a right. Keeps it in the realm of law. And He says it is not as if the respect concept of tolerance has conquered the permission concept of tolerance in modern democracy. Because on certain issues, respect concept of tolerance also, uh, in fact, situates the tolerated and the tolerant at two different levels, like in the permission concept. So you can very well see that tolerance, uh, even as it sounds like a neutral, transcendent, innocent virtue, is deeply imbued with certain questions of politics and power relations, which will be greatly dealt with by Wendy. Okay. Uh, since I don't have to listen with you right now, just give me some more. So, what we have now here is Rhino Forest talking about the permission and the respect conception. So the respect conception is horizontally placed and it still does not break away from the hierarchy of the tolerant and the tolerated. Now, if we kind of take it a little further, what are the problems here? The problem is that this is at the conceptual level. It completely blocks itself from the question of power relations as evidently clearly and pretty. So, and there's also a recorded debate between the two. Now, very quickly moving on to Wendy Brown. Wendy Brown wrote this book some 10 years ago, more than that, regulating abortion. Now, she is making a very interesting case, which is of great importance to me right now. Where she's saying that liberal democracies have, in fact, in recent times, in the last 3 to 4 decades, have birthed tolerance in a very new way. In a way that tolerance has gained a new kind of currency, where tolerance becomes, in fact, a medium, for the operation of power relations, where tolerance uh, appears as a transcendent, neutral, ethical virtue, as a benign, almost like a wine character, like very benign, which speaks of the goodness of character, and hence hides the workings of power relations. So, what is it about her concept of tolerance? She says that tolerance is deeply ideological in function. First of all, she is making a distinction between tolerance in terms of or how we go about our daily lives. Every minute of our life virtually is about tolerance. We understand, right? So there is this individual attribute where we kind of make peace with things around us. Maybe this is a chair I do not like, but I make do with it. I am a neighbor I do not like, I make do with it. I am traveling in the metro train. I meet up, I am seated next to someone I do not like, I make do with it. You have a friend who laughs in a particular manner, you make do with it. But she is not talking about tolerance as it operates in this fashion. That is, where it is immediately limited to what is called the individual choices or the individual, not choices, the individual disposition. However, what she says, even as this is a matter of individual disposition, this is not outside politics. And what liberal democracy is, by its very entrenched focus on the individuals, what they do is or what it does, let's not call it they, what it does is it in fact expands the burden of this adjective in order to subsume the larger function. And to rephrase, in other words, I'm trying to say is that it reduces larger historical political questions to a matter of individual versus individual, uh, habits, individual attributes, etc. The other aspect of tolerance, which interests her greatly, is the question of difference. Now, when tolerance, how do you teach tolerance? So she's talking in the context of America, where you actually teach tolerance to students in schools, right? And what do they do? When you teach tolerance, she says, you teach students, these young minds, to tolerate people who are different, right? So I'm just going to make four broad points about her idea of tolerance and quickly move on to Nehru and Gandhi. And if I overshoot time, then please do let me. Maybe 10 minutes prior to where I am. Right? So she says that tolerance depoliticizes. Right? One. I'll come back to these and elaborate each of these. Second is tolerance, in fact, instead of resolving a conflict, it sustains a conflict as well as it actively essentializes the differences. The third is by reducing liberalism. Now, the third is mainly concerned with the political ideology of liberalism. Where liberalism in its pretends to be a universal uh, kind of fashions itself as the only political ideology called, which refuses to be conquered by the question of religion or culture. Right? So culture is something which I have not mentioned so far, which will prominently feature when I discuss our own Gandhi and Nehru. So she says that liberalism, when it foregrounds its focus or its trust on tolerance, it kind of fashions itself that it is standing outside the culture. Although it is as much a part of culture as any other political formation. And the fourth important point that she is making is the market rationality. The how we kind of almost like a kind of a contemporary legend that you say that you work hard, you succeed, right? Or to put it like this, if you have a right attitude, you get justice. Now, what it leaves out is the structural framework within which these articulations are made. Right? So these are four important kind of aspects of our discussion which I will take up in little further detail. Which from where I kind of draw upon the topic of the conversation. That is the subject of tolerance. Now I'm using it in the twin sense of the term. One is who is the subject of tolerance, right? Who is, in some sense, is subjected to tolerance, and what is it that not only tolerates but creates that object of tolerance, right? And of course, subject as a focus. So the subject, English subject. Yeah, what is your subject English? So what is your focus on? So I mean, I try to kind of refer to these strands of the discussion. So Wendy Brown is saying that the real functioning of this term, tolerance, its virtue, can only be evident to us if we look at it, within the context in which it operates, right? So the context tells you about the power relations and how it constitutes the subjects anew, with where they are located. It tells us where they are located, how they are related, and uh, it also, in some sense, dehistoricizes, right? So let's go to the first aspect that I delineated here. Although she's saying many other things, but for our purposes, this will do. That it first depoliticizes. So, for example, for example, think again about something that we are told about, or something that we are taught, or something that we learn very really. I'm not saying essentially in a classroom. So, the moment we discover that it is, or someone is different on account of what they believe in, how they think, how they live, etc. What Wendy Brown is saying that in that moment, in modern liberal democracies, the question of tolerance shifts our attitude from that belief to the identity, right? And of course, identity is a product of difference. So, what it does, in fact, in the first move, is it tolerance by appearing to be transcendent, ethical virtue, innocent virtue. It kind of leaves us to leave behind the you can say the history, the politics behind that, and accept, or in fact withstand, or be, or make peace with that person by depoliticizing the reasons for our relation, or let's say the political historical reasons behind the emergence of that particular act. So this movement from belief to identity, in the second move, what it does, it essentializes that difference, right? So, for example, I think probably this will help us understand a little more clearly, although I believe today will be a better place to talk more about it maybe. Think about how we relate to a disabled person, right? So some of us will call him differently abled, some of us will call him disabled, some of us will be called especially people with special abilities, or you have Divyang, etc. There's a whole host of terms there. So what do? We Our attitude towards that person is almost, to again invoke Brown term, is a therapeutic attitude, where we merely kind of accept for what he or she lacks, and not, and kind of move away from the question that why do we relate to the person on account, or in such a manner. In other words, we move away from the question of difference. That where is this picture of difference emerging from? Let me put it like this. What are the historical political forces acting upon this relation, which only in some sense fits me, with relation to that subject? That we can only relate to that person in a particular way where it will be benign and it will be devoid of any political question or historical question. And hence, by extension, we leave behind the question of justice, which even Diana Forrest is saying. I probably forgot to mention that. He says that both permission and respect conception fail to account for the question of justice. So he kind of offers the justice conception. But then again, what's the point of doing this if you are very much talking about the language of rights? Unlike Brown, who's saying that tolerance is something which is not legislative, right? Something which is not mandated by law. In fact, she says it is in addition to law. It is in addition to law. In addition to the laws in place that that we practice tolerance. Now, the third important point that she is making is that how tolerance, now if I open up discussion a bit, think about, as I had kind of invited you to remind yourself in how many different ways we use the term tolerance, right? Think about the domain of medicine. Can your body tolerate this medicine? Right? Can it tolerate that antibiotic? Or think about the world of plants. A certain plant will, the flowers will wilt and it will die out if a particular kind of chemical has been used, right? So it cannot tolerate that. So tolerance, the tolerance level. A lot of people say I'm lactose intolerant. I am intolerant to gluten, right? So these phrases they kind of tell you that tolerance in itself uh, it signifies three very important you can say aspects to itself. One of them could be that tolerance only appears at the limits, right? And there is this inimical relationship between a certain host and the foreign object, right? So there is this self and the other, the foreign object, and it is only to a point that these two can cohabit. Now, tolerance as it circulates, it instead of dealing with the once again, I go back to what I said earlier. Instead of dealing with the historical and political reasons for the way in which the difference emerges, or the way in which, the form in which, what is the structural form in which that difference emerges, instead of touching up, allowing one to get there, tolerance masks that. That's why I call it facade. So it masks that, and in fact allows you to transact at a level where it appears to be benign by depoliticizing. So as a therapeutic, as a charitable, as a benevolent, etc. Now let's go back to the second important point, that is of essentialization. So when it masks that difference, and even as it is invoked as a promise, as if holding a certain promise towards resolving that conflict, what it does, in fact, is it essentializes those differences. So, as I said, does not allow us to historically engage. So, in whatever form it has been circulating, it essentializes. So, I do not want to mention Foucault here, but of course, I'm sure you can sense that how closely it is, in fact, it reflects on Foucault's idea of discourse as well as governmentality. So, as a discursive operation, it constitutes its own truth, as in and is in fact in turn regulated by that truth, and as a governmental function. So that will probably appear when I move to Gandhi and Nehru. That how at the level of governance, of population, of groups, it kind of provides a model where the conduct of conduct is in some sense determined. Anyway, so it essentializes those differences and sustains that. You can say, I don't want to use the word hostility, but sustains that inimical incommensurability between these two identities. So, from belief to identity, based on the concretization and essentialization of those differences, and then liberalism in the liberal democracy, tolerance then becomes the cornerstone, of situating and sustaining that power relation, right? Which is further, you can say, rationalized as common sense, or you can call it as something which is self-evident, self-explanatory by the logic of individuals. I don't like this, and it's my choice. I don't feel like sitting with someone. I don't feel like being with someone. So I give you an example. I have kept it non-religious so far, so I'll give you a secular example. Something that all of us can probably think about even further. Can someone please confirm, do I have 15 minutes or 10 minutes? Hello?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. That is. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes, you can. Yeah, you can. You have time. You have time. Right, go ahead. Yeah.
Can I take about 12 minutes from now?
You can take 15, 20 minutes. No issue. Yeah.
Thanks. So let me give you an example. Think about, and this is nothing complex, it's something that you probably keep witnessing or read about in the newspaper. So there is a certain amount of aversion towards the question of reservation in educational institutions, right? Now, it's not about reservation. I'm not going into the merits of reservation or why is it opposed, etc. Time for that. But I'm very sure you have come across a situation where, let's say, a student gets selected, and you discover that he or she has made it by making use of that provision, right? Now, what is the place of that provision in the in one's imagination? It can be me, you, anyone who is thinking about that, right? Now, what is the place of that provision? So that provision is a provision. It's a legal provision, for example. But it is immediately making us think about that person, almost like reduce the person to that provision first, in the first one. And then what it does not allow us to think about it historically. It does not allow us to think about it as something which he or she is, you can say, very rightfully deserving. And more importantly, even while you do not feel the hostility, there could be a group that is hostile. Our country and our nation has seen a lot of very bloodied and hostile movements against it, right? But even in good sense, like, and I consider myself an aware person, and I feel that yes, they've been historically wronged, and it is important in the interest of representation, whatnot. It is not a garibi hata or whatever. But at the end of it, even as I do not feel the hostility, that difference figures and I tolerate. Right? Why? Because somewhere I fail to admit of a different concept of justice than what the liberal individual market rationality of hard work, of right attitude, of right connections, etc. has taught me to believe. Right? And in doing so, what this example in fact shows for me is that you tolerate, and in tolerating, you have already situated the person in a certain identitarian framework, which is on your own terms, right? So, what tolerance is doing here is is not breaking away from, uh, you know, so this makes for a rather more interesting case than religion is because even prior to the admission or even prior to gaining membership of a universal forum, quote unquote, ideally we think of university as belonging to everyone. But then when everyone comes and joins the university, it also hurts us, right? We do not want it for everyone. So when everyone begins to join, our historical differences make it very difficult for one group or the other to kind of think of everyone as one of everyone, right? So here, even though as an enlightened individual I invoke tolerance, I in fact essentialize that difference, right? And I put up with it. Quite literally, I put up with it. If I blend into Hindi, I might as well say कि अब और कितना चाहिए? Like you know what I'm saying? So how much more room do I make for these people? You know, and I'm not talking about caste-based reservations. I'm talking about all kinds of provisions which in the eyes of those who do not make use of that provision uh, also ends up reducing those human beings who also we kind of abide by the idea of humanism, right? Generally, was insaniya, but it also for us we reduce that person to that particular, you can say, provision, and in doing so we deny them history, etc. Anyway, now this is how tolerance operates discursively with these three, four, five modes that I have discussed so far. Now let's come back to very quickly. Come back to why I chose to circulate those readings by Nehru and Gandhi. See, there are two reasons for that. One is historically the question of tolerance has largely, in fact, been a kind of prime focus for political theorists, thinkers, religious leaders, very much like Arnold, that I have chosen for the reason that it kind of touches upon the very raw questions of religious belonging, historically speaking. From Enlightenment onwards, you will find that it has emerged from, like in the Renaissance, 15th, 16th century, you find that it emerges when certain heretics were allowed to be members of church. And in 17th century England, similar, you can say, post-Reformation, when similar different, you can say, formations were emerging, the word that was used was comprehension, because they allowed them to comprehend. So religion has remained. That's why the word belief, even though all these political theorists are talking about quote unquote secular habitations, secular attitudes, the religious moorings of the question has not been entirely, you can say, has not entirely washed away. Very much remains. Secondly, why did I choose these two? There are other people who have written about tolerance, the importance, the virtue. For example, Ambedkar has very clearly written about the relationship between state, religion, different communities, etc. But I have chosen these two for the reason that first of all, these two have also exchanged, ideas based on this, and they represent two very different approaches to the question of tolerance. And I think that difference will emerge because rather patient and relaxed reading of Gandhi, particularly. Because from what I have explained so far, you might, in fact, you might already see that where Nehru is coming. Now, for Nehru, interestingly, he places, And the third, and another important reason was, of course, the question of secularism. Now, before I go on to talk about Nehru and Gandhi, just one important quick remark is uh, I want to kind of underscore the ideological character of certain concepts and ideas that become so diffused in our political social discourses that they can begin to mean anything. So they have not only been, we can say that the concept has not only been expansive, but rather in some sense it has been evaluated or sometimes of its content, or sometimes it has become so diffused that it has really been left for people to use and invoke as and when they please. To give you an example, my favorite example is the word secular. I don't want to talk about secularism. Maybe hopefully sometime, I mean, on another occasion when I meet you, hopefully I will probably talk about it. But think about the word secular. A few months back, I remember that a food delivery, these apps, app-based food delivery services. One of them was kind of hounded for something related to having delivered meat or non-meat and to a vegetarian or a non-meat eating person. Now that ad was targeted that it is not secular. Now think about it that an ad also has a political character. So George Orwell once said in one of his essays that sometimes words they lose meaning, or sometimes they, and that is a telltale sign of a certain direction in which your political arrangement, social arrangement, your terms of existence is moving, right? So, and similarly, that's of course simple. I don't want to go beyond that. Think about tolerance. We're talking about tolerance. We of course talk about tolerance in terms of religion, but we also talked about tolerance in the context and articulations which seem to be religious or religion inspired, but if you think over it, you don't find anything remotely religious. For example, if a certain person complains or raises a concern that we are fast losing this virtue of tolerance, right? And then you have a certain human cry that he or she is wrong and we have always been tolerant. Now, these mark the paradox of this movement. This is something which both Ghana Forest and Brown are also talking about. That the meaning is, as students of critical theory, would have already come across so many formulations through Saussure and Hall and everyone, Barth, etc., both structuralist and post-structuralist, that how meaning is to be understood in its circulation, right? In its relation, references. And as I said, I'll come back to this example. As I said, that this tolerance operates discursively. It also operates as a subterranean supplement. It also, and for example, an imperial state like USA can justify its decision to invade another country in the name of tolerance. Think about it. That the discourse of tolerance will justify an act of invasion because they breach the limit of tolerance. How that social formation is to be is in fact not tolerable. So in order to conserve and preserve the principle of tolerance, we have to go to that extent. Now here, when, as I said, if somebody proclaims that we are fast losing the virtue of tolerance, shared virtue of tolerance, uh, that person is bullied, is it's called names, etc. Now, that is not because he or she is lying or telling the truth. That's what is what interests me. What interests me here is that what are the terms upon which those who would criticize this person will call him intolerant, or let's say call him to be a bigot, a person who has partial view, etc. In other words, what is it about the principle of tolerance in itself which does not allow for it to be thought about in any other way than as a benign virtue? So tolerance can also in fact figure in the most intolerant fashion when it is thought about in terms of violation. Right? Now, coming very quickly to conclude in about 5 to 7 minutes from now, I'll conclude and then I'll more interested in listening to you. That, as you would, I would in fact just briefly share my reading of Nehru and Gandhi and then leave it for you to fill in. That one of the differences that you find. So one of the sentences that has remained to me from Nehru's letters that I shared with you is he says that you can't progress, the nation can't survive unless you have perfect tolerance, right? So Nehru for me is struggling, even as he is kind of subscribing to the enlightened idea of individual nation and individual rights, etc. He is struggling to place that boundary to tolerance. And he says that, and in that letter on intolerance, he says he says that if somebody is, let's say, blowing conch shell or even slaughtering an animal, you have no right. You have to be perfectly tolerant. But he goes on to say only a request can be made. If you read it, you find it. He says, and I find it very interesting. He says only a request can be made. Now, what is the how do we make sense of that request? What does that request mean? What is the political constitution of that request? Let me put it like that. On the other hand, instead, if you look at Gandhi, so or to kind of stay with Nehru for a moment. Nehru's religion is outside and inside. Religion should stay inside. Religion should result in inner reformation, etc. But it should have no reason to be outside. For Gandhi, and I'm being very compact here. For Gandhi, he very clearly says, I don't want to mislead you. I believe in politics that has religion in it. But he of course qualifies what he means by religion. He's not talking about the instrumental use of religion, right? He's talking about religion as a certain matter of disposition. But for Gandhi, for me, is very important in this context because I began with the question. One of the questions which I kind of floated in the very beginning is that what do we do when we tolerate? What sources are we mobilizing when we tolerate? What is it that is in motion? So Gandhi is interesting because Gandhi already presumes tolerance in the other person, even when there is no tolerance evidently. Very important to remember. Secondly, Gandhi is someone who believes, whose politics is driven by a very pronounced idea of imperfection. Right? So imperfection, he calls, you read that, he calls himself and his politics, his search for truth as a journey of imperfection. where he says, I do not shy away from admitting. I keep admitting I'm wrong, and I keep on experimenting. So he's already, and he says that with respect to religion and its followers, that we are imperfect people. And truth is supreme and perfect like God. So we have to keep on persisting in our own imperfections. And it is precisely because of imperfection that we can tolerate each other, that we cannot claim superiority. And so Gandhi, in that sense, is in fact is fascinating because he is trying to break away from the way the discursive function of tolerance situates hierarchically stratifies the tolerated and the tolerant. Although it's question, I'm sure there are more learned, uh, scholars of Gandhi. But my reading was, as I did, that he is trying to move in a different direction from what his discourse tolerance are trying to do. So even as tolerance constitutes these subject positions, Gandhi, by very much like his, his he kind of glorifies, eulogizes the idea of satyagraha, abstinence, where suffering is a motivation. And that suffering, what does it do? It suffering, in some sense, dilutes the claim of sovereignty over of an external agent over one's body. Right? So I was reading a very important scholar, Basil Dev, you may have heard of him. He writes in his book on Gandhi, Impossible Subject, that Gandhi has virtually split, not virtually, vertically split the concept of sovereignty by, in fact, allowing, or let's say, by playing up the question, the idea of dying, and by suppressing, or let's say, by downplaying and by a rather sinful admission of killing as a virtue in politics. He's against killing, but he's very much in favor of dying. So what does it do? It kind of steals the thunder. And there's something similar to my mind happening here, where he says that we are all imperfect. I mean, among the different writings that have circulated, there's a section on tolerance you will find there. And in one of the letters from the collected works that I've shared, you find where he talks about politics and religion. I think I will stop here, though I had a few more things to say, but I'll probably bring them in during the course of our exchanges and discussion. So thank you once again. So I have begun with 2 questions, and I'm ending with those questions. As I said, I leave them unanswered. That is intolerance the opposing or the opposite or the contra to tolerance? Is it contra tolerance? Is it the lack of tolerance which is intolerance, or does it kind of mean more than that? And secondly, as I just pick up again, what is it that we do? Thank you, and I really invite the questions and discussion. See, I'm also trying to learn with you. I'm also trying to learn with during the course of discussions. I have done the same readings that you did, so please do not presume that my words prevail over yours. Thanks.
Thank you so much, sir, for your thought-provoking lecture. We shall now move on to the question-answer session. And the first question we have is by Deepa Mukherjee. Do you think there is a dichotomy in the concept of tolerance? Intolerance to humor that emerge out of difference, like sexist, racist, casteist, ageist humors, are often interpreted as being too touchy, not having sense of humor, too prone to take offense. Not being tolerant is denying others the space for their own opinions and tolerating or or whether not registering dissent is being an accomplice. How would you address the fine line? Or can this line be practically maintained?
So shall I respond to this one or shall I take one question?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You can respond.
Right. So question is okay. Do you think there is a dichotomy in the concept of tolerance? Intolerance to humor that emerge out of difference? Like, okay, often it has been to achieve not having sense of humor. Not being tolerant is denying others space for their own opinion. Well, I think thank you for the question, Deepa. First of all, it is true that there's a certain Manichaeism in the way we address the questions of political questions in our daily life. However, I think the question touches upon one of the questions that I left unanswered, that is intolerance. Now, think about this. If you have a neighbor who is casteist, who is racist, who is sexist, so if one were to be asked to invoke the question, the norm of tolerance, so would you rather want a tolerant casteist, a tolerant racist, or would you rather prefer someone who can be addressed for these objectionable views historically and politically? So tolerance here can only go so far as to figure that subject as a tolerant racist person. Nobody wants a tolerant racist. That's because that again, in fact, underscores what Brown is saying when she says that it essentializes. Now you're saying whether intolerance to humor that emerge out of difference, like I said, is often interpreted as being too touchy. Now, touchy, lacking a sense of humor, lacking sensibility, is how do we conclude that these are a matter of individual spaces and individual preferences? Now, are they outside history? Are these questions of disposition and taste, are they outside history? So, when the object of tolerance is kept outside history, the individual defense of not liking something, of that hostility towards something, also figures outside history. So development of taste, of disposition, of certain inhibition, all of that then kind of is depoliticized, right? Now I don't know how to answer. But I can be practically maintained. I mean, I don't know. I have no answer to that because I'm not here to tell you, or I cannot. I don't have resources to in fact come up with a certain way of being to reach it. I don't want to do that. Yes. Can I move on to the next question? Thank you. If I have not answered the question, please you can ask again or rephrase it.
Sure, sir. Thank you. So, Krishnanand says, heartfelt thanks, Danish sir, for extensive discussion on the concept of tolerance. Thoroughly enjoyed your talk. You have rightly pointed out that tolerance is not transcendental benign virtue. There is always an inimical relationship between the host and foreign object. The idea of self and other comes in. Tolerance is a patronizing posture. Power relation is involved in it. Can't we substitute tolerance with mutual respect in academic and political discourse?
This is something that we already do, Krishna. Thank you for your kind words, but this is something that we already do. What I was trying to do through this conversation was to tease out the strands of power relation in the way we understand tolerance. Of course, but not only academic or political discourse, as I said in our daily life situations, it is a virtue worth having. I'm not, first of all, please don't feel that I'm against tolerance. I'm not saying that. What I'm doing is, I'm kind of, by my readings of these political theorists and Gandhi Nehru, I was trying to bring out that what are the limitations in the way, in the way tolerance is conceptualized in that particular way, as against another conception of tolerance. Now, can we substitute? See, and in academic and political discourse, these are two different kinds of discourses, right? Academic discourse is a completely different matter. Academic discourse is it kind of, or to kind of rephrase academic, that which goes in the name of academic freedom, uh, is like it is its own guard. It is its own sentinel, right? We do not like others to tell that what universities should be teaching or what students in university should be learning, right? We want it to be a self-regulated space, right? And I think problems arise only when this intervention is made that the question of tolerance also emerges. Otherwise, academic exchanges are not happening, are not carried out on the terms of tolerance. You know what I'm saying? So if I'm listening to you, or if I'm listening to, or you as a student of Vivek, you're listening to him in a classroom, you're not listening to him because he's someone who just walked in. There are other relationships in place. There are other structures in place, and that's how academics function. Political discourse is an entirely different matter, and I have already mentioned the respect conception. Nehru is in fact for mutual respect, right? Nehru is in fact going on to talk about, he also mentions indifference. Gandhi very clearly, explicitly denies indifference. We have to understand that how the two are different in that respect. Also, Gandhi is not saying a request is to be made. Request presumes that distance, and it also celebrates that distance. Gandhi is intimate in that sense. He is seeking that intimacy. You know what I'm saying? So I think probably, it depends on what seems more persuasive. My mind, and the what I liked in Nehru was also that he is willing to admit the gaps that Gandhi is pointing out. If you read it closely, the two essays and Gandhi's writings on tolerance and religion, you'll find that Nehru, when he is writing on religion and secular state, you'll find in both his writings that he's willing to accommodate what Gandhi has to teach, or he very well says that I'm of a different persuasion. Yes, can we move on to the next question? I will read out. So, could you please share your views on intersection of religion and politics? Well, best friend, man. Doctor, best friend. Best friend. So, I'm sorry. Intersection of religion and politics. This is too wide a subject to I can't comment upon that unless you specify that. You have to specify. Otherwise, but I can only talk about with reference to what I have said. That Gandhi, as you may have read, is very clear about it, but not the instrumental religion. You have to remember that. What do I mean by instrumental religion? Something that you will find in the writings of the distinction that Nandiya makes in his writings. Faith, religion as faith, and religion as ideology. So unless you specify, I think I'll leave it at that. Will we ever be able to put religion outside our political and social structures when religion is ingrained in our thoughts and political and social ideas and guided by our personal thoughts? At one level, this distinction between individual thoughts and political social thought is difficult to maintain. Okay, so if at all you have to question, you will have to kind of rethink on that distinction between what is personal. So our political and social structures shape what we take to be personal. And Wendy Brown is in fact precisely talking about this, that how this tolerance functions essentially by projecting itself as a benign virtue or a personal attribute devoid of any political implications or a product of political relations. So another way of answering or addressing this question, whether we will ever be put religious outside of political and social structures. But this fragment of the question will lead you to the debate on secularism. And that is something that will take some time, and I don't think this is the occasion for that. Will we ever be able to put, whether you want to put or you do not want to put, that is again another question. So maybe on some other occasion. Probably does not belong to this moment because this will be an entirely different. It's a very important topic, and people have been writing and speaking on this. But it will take time. So instead of giving you a half-hearted, incomplete response, I would rather
Thank you so much, sir, for answering all the questions. Now I invite Sakis Chatterjee to give the final vote of thanks. A very good afternoon to one and all present here. I, on behalf of Intersections Banaras Hindu University.
Yes,
Okay.
That is you have 10 to 15 minutes.
Huh?
Then you have 10 to 15 minutes, or can you finish it off?
No, if you I can stay back. Yeah, I'm willing to stay back.
No, because I just want your opinion on certain things. Sorry, Sakshi, and then just give us 5 minutes.
Yes, it's absolutely okay.
Sorry, can you repeat it?
Sorry?
Yeah, and I couldn't hear you properly. Now I can. Yeah.
That is put your camera off because there is internet issue one, I wanted you to just say some opinion of favorite views that when you are reading articles, right? So we are talking about that religion in a way is something that you cannot keep out of politics, right? And you are looking at it. So most of our
I'm sorry, but I think there's a problem with the audio.
Just a second. Ask the next question by the time. Ask the next question.
Yes, sir. Sir, we have one more question. Sir, it says humanity becomes always the victim of narrow politics and narrow and wrong interpretations of religion. So don't you think that nowadays tolerance is more in terms of humanity rather than religion and politics?
See, once again I should make it very clear that my sole objective of this conversation was to center stage tolerance as concept was thinking. Alright, I was not, and I certainly, and should make it very clear, I'm not against the idea of tolerance. I'm not questioning that why someone thinks he or she is tolerant. I'm not questioning that. All I'm saying, or I'm not even questioning its status as a virtue. All I'm doing is what is happening behind that. How does it figure as a virtue? What does it do in its circulation? What does it do in its operation? How are we to conceptualize it? That is a very slippery concept. It is not legislated, yet it is mandatorily expected that someone behaves a certain way. So, as an ethic, as a civic virtue, this is what led, and this is what my interest is in this subject. And not of course it is important. It's not denying that it is always, and once again, I would rather invoke Gandhi when he says that if everyone is imperfect, then why do we have so many faiths? He says that this is not a problem for me, because he says I can never imagine a world where only one faith is, people believe only in one faith, and since he stresses on the imperfection of both of the followers as well as the seekers of truth, right? So Gandhi very passingly also says that so whatever is contained or whatever is the content of the religion or the word of God, it may be perfect or not, but it is only available to us through the medium of human language. Or in another Nietzschean turn, he says, it is only through the medium of humanity that it is available. So that makes it important. It's a very fine distinction that he's making between faith, followers, and truth, right? And this allows him to use the idea of imperfection as a political force to kind of bring together people and envision a togetherness or a collectivity which breaks through the stratified subjectivity that tolerance in its liberal regime offers. Let me put it like this. I'm not against tolerance, of course not. This is not even a question for me. Thank you.
So we have a couple of more questions. Sir, can you please share some further readings on tolerance?
Okay. My advice would be something that I was myself late to arrive at. That we are somehow fascinated by secondary readings, right? So I would be rather, let's say, more pulled towards reading Michael Walzer and Brown or even Post. These are political theorists in their own right, perfect. Or even Rawls. However, I would really insist, in fact, on the importance of reading the primary writings of figures who, for us, may form the resources of tolerance, and then go on to read these commentaries on the concept or political balance of tolerance. For example, if you read Gandhi or Ambedkar or Nehru or in some such others, or even literary figures like Premchand, Renu, or if you go back in time, the Bhakti period, you find a lot of discourses that are a lot of writings and reflections that are in fact anchored in this discourse, right? So I would suggest if you are beginning to look at the question of tolerance, look at these movements first to probably develop a critical understanding. Of course, these are people who have prominently written on. Susan Mendes has written Wendy Brown has written, as again Diana Foster has written, Michael Walzer has written. These are the people who are most often cited among the theorists, or political liberalism of Rawls' theory of justice of Rawls and his extended readings. But you know what? I must make this admission that I could have given a fuller account had I decided to take into account the question of secularism. The reason I did not do that is I did not want us to think about the question of tolerance only within the domain of religious belonging. You know, think about the queer rights, think about the basic question of race, think about the question of language. You know, we have riots on the question of language, we have tensions happening on the question of language. Of course, religious belonging is there, religious strife is there. I'm always happy to talk about the question of secularism, but that would have meant that this would probably eclipse some of the more foundational questions. So, yeah, that would be my response to the readings.
So another question is, are the terms Islamophobic, Hinduphobic, etc. subjectivities inside the discourse of religious tolerance? Another question is, communal is communal harmony altogether a different discourse or an aspect within the discourse of religious tolerance?
Islamophobic, Hinduphobic, at one level, yes, they operate within the discourse of religious tolerance. But I do not entirely buy the idea of Islamophobia universally, okay, or Hinduphobia. You have to understand. I mean, think about it. What was the first? I don't think you can dig out these terms, particularly in our own context, from 10 years ago or 5 years ago. You know? So when you think about, like you're calling it a subject position or subjectivity, what is engendering these subjectivities? You know? Are they effect of other discourses? Yes. Are they effect of multiple discourses? Yes. You know, so Islamophobia, if one were to invoke this term here, I don't think it stands scrutiny beyond a point unless that discourse is flowing from a certain global discourse, you know, which is a questionable point for me. You know, I don't, but as far as this question goes, yes. Is communal harmony altogether a different discourse? Or no, it's not a different discourse. It is just another name for respect, for harmony, respect. It also circulates within the framework of religious discourse, or to give you another term, Sardam Sambhav. Sardam Sambhav is how it goes. But this is again a political proposition. These are political, I would say, these are also informed by certain power relations and politically constituted. That remains true. The first part of the discourse of the religious tolerance.
Thank you so much, sir, for your wonderful comments. Now, you have answered all the questions very wonderfully, and now I would like to invite Vaisakhi Chatterjee to give the final vote of thanks.
Just a moment, Vivek wanted to say something, right?
Yeah, actually, I was thinking that you should
Now you're
not.
audible.
Yeah, actually, what happens? I have a lot of earphones over my table. So once some are rotten. So unfortunately, I picked one of them which are not good. Okay, no, actually, I wanted you to remain seated till my students make proper use of you. Okay, so I thought I thought I'll ask something. So, okay, so what I was thinking that obviously it's already 12:30. I was thinking that obviously the question is broad, but your opinion would matter to us. That when we were reading the articles, uh, uh,
Yeah, I mean, if you have anything to say regarding those articles that I circulated, I would be more than happy. I didn't go on talking about it because I thought it would be the discussion. Yes, Vivek, please go ahead.
there is that we cannot distance religion from politics, right? So a lot of my students were confused that, like you were talking about Nandi, that he's talking about religion as an instrumental, or religion as an ideology, or as a faith. So could you throw some light, like what he mean by this, and what we should not misunderstand when we are talking about that religion should cannot we cannot divorce religion from politics.
Can I ask a question? Who are you attributing this to? Who is saying this?
This is a Gandhi when he's talking about that.
Okay, Gandhi, right? Okay. So these are two different visions of the place of religion. Just give me a second.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for the distraction. Yeah. So there are two conceptions that emerge. I mean, two visions rather in Nehru and Gandhi, right? So again, I will probably keep it very brief, but this cannot be talked about without throwing some light on the question of secularism, right? And religious tolerance. So religious tolerance has come to occupy the very heart of this political discourse. That is secularism. So Nehru is of the view, and he mentions in one of the readings that how the West is, prospering because they first became secular, and then they came to adopt secularism, and now we are going to be a secular state, and with time we hope to be secular. That was Nehru's promise. We all know what happened to that promise. But in Gandhi, when Gandhi is thinking about religion and state, and with Gandhi's adversarial stance, let's say, towards modernity, state in itself is something that Gandhi would be very suspicious of, right? It's a different temporality. And patience has a virtue for Gandhi. So if there is a conflict between two people, perhaps Gandhi would like, and I'm told that you also had a session in Swaraj, probably this many sessions, that he would rather have it resolved without the intervention of the state, with a certain internal transformation, right? Which is questionable, but I'm just trying to explicate what Gandhi is about. What does this tell you? It tells us that Gandhi is of a different temporality, right? So let's not put the two together. When Gandhi is saying that, let me be very clear that religion and politics cannot be divorced. He's also saying, as is evident in another reading that I circulated, writing by Nehru, when Nehru is saying that Bapu says one cannot envision a life without, a man can't envision his life without religion. So if you put these two moments together, you will understand that what is Nehru's understanding and approach to religion and what is Gandhi's. When I say that Gandhi is talking about bringing together religion and politics, Gandhi is not talking about religion as a force to be mobilized in an instrumental manner so as to become a political typical force of, you can say, coercion, oppression, whatever. Instead, he's talking about religion as that which provides you with certain resources to negotiate and navigate through these tentacles of modern life, as well as through, or also provides that substratum for the collective social existence. And this is something which later commentators, like those who are against, or I won't say against, but those who have critiqued, let's not reduce critique to against, those who have critiqued the notion of Western concept of secularism. But two of the names are very prominent. One of them is, of course, Nandi, also because he made his remarks much earlier than anyone else did now. He's been saying it since 80s and 90s. And T.N. Madan, right? If you read these two people, you find that Nandi's again he in fact draws upon the tradition and sources that people live by in order to navigate the question of difference. In Madan is also of the view that such a formation, such a you can call the deracinated, uprooted, abstract view of life has no place. I mean, it will be alien in a life world which is so profusely, you know, filled with the supernatural, the transcendent, and in people's life in India. So what he does, he says that in Indian society, then the sacred is the secular is wrapped in sacred. Pardon me if I phrased it wrongly, but this, if I recall correctly, this is what he says, that the secular is wrapped in sacred. So it is in this, Gandhi's idea of bringing together politics and religion is in fact a way of recovering those resources, and not using it instrumentally. Because what happens then is when religion is used ideologically, that it operates in tandem with state power, right? And all examples of that, there are many examples which are written around us, where religion circulates as an ideology. It in fact is complemented by state power and receives into a violence of very, it's a very violent formation. I could, I can talk more about it, but then I don't want to place, from whatever I said in the past few minutes and what I will say from now on, I do not want this to shadow your understanding. That's why I did not mention it. Otherwise, I'll be delighted to talk about questions. It presents a very different kind of case, a different kind of debate, from what we see unfolding in other places. So, however, let me make it very clear, when Gandhi is bringing together or not divorcing religion from politics, it does not take religion to be what how Nehru is talking about. Nehru is talking about as something as a privatized enterprise, right? But Gandhi is saying that it impairs something that forms you. See, this is one of the doings of the modern liberal democracy. There, it of course places those necessary restrictions, right? But it refuses to admit that its idea of religion, of secularism. I would also flag this opinion uh, based on some of the recent scholarship on secularism that the separation of state and religion, as mandated by electoral democracy, electoral state, is also informed by the understanding of religion. Right? So it is not something which is pre-given. So in redrawing this, in when the state keeps redrawing its boundaries, it is also defining what is religious, what is not religious, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. And religion then is not merely a matter of which God or religious system, belief system you believe, or if you are a Muslim or Hindu, Christian, say, whatever. Rather, for example, think about this the issue of headscarf as it became widely a divisive issue in France, right? So when it headscarf, in fact, it began to function as a framework of thinking. Now, in that moment, whether one can go to the beach, to the classroom, to the marketplace, or then drive or walk wearing headscarf. And when the state is responding to a situation like that, and it redraws its boundary, it is also telling us about what practices are religious practices and what practices are not religious practices. So instead of looking at it, let's say, as a practice of clothing, in a different context, it appears as a practice, a religious practice, right? So it also provides us with a framework for the state to think about a particular moment, a particular issue, a particular occasion, and on that occasion, it uses that as a framework. Think about what is religion, what is not, what is religious, what is not religious, what is acceptable, etc. So Gandhi is not talking about religion as an instrumentality of religion, more as those resources of the self, which help you find meaning in your lives. Yeah, great. Hello. Hello.
Yes, sir, yes. Yes, sir. So, moving on for the final vote of thanks.
Thank you, Abdullah, for inviting me. A very good afternoon to one and all present here. I, on behalf of Intersections Banaras Hindu University, extend profound gratitude to all those who have assisted in achieving such a pronounced outcome of this lecture. Firstly, I must mention our deep sense of appreciation and sincere thanks to our chief speaker, Mr. Danish Iqbal. Thank you, sir, for your reinvigorating and intriguing talk on the topic, the subject of tolerance, where you talked about the concept of tolerance and toleration, and so as to how does that operate. With reference to a Russian and an American political theorist, followed by Gandhi and Nehru, and many such insightful points. Thank you, sir. I would like to take this opportunity to place on record our hearty thanks to Dr. Vivek Singh. Sir, it's solely because of your motivation, support, and guidance extended to all of us that we are able to hear such preeminent and prestigious intellectuals. I also extend my thanks to all the participants for their gracious presence and enormous cooperation. Thank you.
Sir, then we can take it over now. Iqbal,
Hey,
it's over.
okay, thank you everyone. I thoroughly enjoyed talking to you. And in a Gandhian fashion, I hope